This video is going to look then at androgyny and the BSRI. So if we look at your specification, there's set things you need to know. You need to know what androgyny is, how we measure androgyny, and the way we do that using the BEM sex role inventory. So they're the three things you must know on the specification. So what is androgyny? Well, androgyny is anyone who displays a balance of masculine and feminine characteristics in their personality. And this could be anything. This could be their attitudes, their behaviours, their traits. So an example might be a man or woman who is competitive and aggressive at work, but a caring and sensitive parent. So they've got those masculine characteristics where they're competitive and aggressive, but they've got those feminine characteristics where they're caring and sensitive. So it's a balance between those two. And people usually get androgyny mixed up and incorrect, and it's not. Okay, this is really important to state that it's not an overrepresentation of the opposite sex characteristics. So a female who is really masculine is not androgynous. Okay, androgyny is where you have a balance of masculine and feminine characteristics in your personality, and that's a really important point if you're going to get the marks in your test. So the main way we measure or assess androgyny is the BSRI, BEM sex role inventory. I've put a link here which shows you what this BSRI will look like. You don't need to answer it now because we're going to spend a little bit of time next lesson having a go at assessing your level of androgyny. But if you open up the link, you can have a look at the type of questions that are going to be coming up. You can even have a go at it if you really want. And what Ben did was she suggested that high levels of androgyny were important for psychological well-being because people could be better equipped to deal with a range of situations. If you had masculine characteristics, feminine characteristics, you were far more able to deal with the stresses and the threats that general everyday life throws at you. Whereas if you only have masculine or only have feminine traits, then you're not going to be as well equipped to deal with those sort of scenarios. And she went further on to say that psychological androgyny was about taking on whichever qualities best fitted the situation that you were in. So if you're in a situation that required masculine characteristics, if you're androgynous, you could use them. If you then went to a different scenario where you needed feminine characteristics, you could bring those qualities to that scenario as well. And what she went on to say was that it is far more adaptive than stereotyped gender identities. And what that means is that it's far better for survival if you can display masculine and feminine characteristics than if you just showed masculine or you just showed feminine characteristics. It would be far more suited for survival if you were androgynous. So if we look at David Beckham, obviously a very high profile celebrity, then he'd probably score very highly on an androgynous scale like the BSRI. He's very highly competitive and aggressive when he's playing sport, and he's also a very caring and sensitive father. So he's showing that balance of masculine and feminine characteristics. There's also been quite a lot of studies done on looking at families who have one androgynous parent. And what they found is that those families who have at least one androgynous parent score far higher on scores such as parental warmth, parental support. And they found that those parents are far more encouraging and more likely to develop a child's self-worth than non-androgynous parents. Most likely because they can display those masculine characteristics when they're needed and the more nurturing feminine characteristics when needed as well. So the BSRI is the questionnaire we use to assess androgyny. And it's made up of 20 masculine characteristics, 20 feminine characteristics, and 20 neutral traits. And it measures it using a Likert scale, in this case a 7-point Likert scale. And you may never have heard the term Likert scale before, but I'm sure you would have all conducted or completed one of these during your time at school. And this Likert scale goes from number 1 being never true of me, to number 7 being always true. So some of you may have done them before. It goes from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And in between you've got strongly agree, don't know, disagree, strongly disagree. So that is a Likert scale where you've got these terms that you just circle or cross against which one matches your opinion. So in this case, we've got a 7-point Likert scale, going from never true of me to always true of me. And the scores will allow the researcher to say your level of androgyny. So if you score highly masculine and low feminine scores, then you'll be classed as masculine. If you get high feminine, low masculine, you're classed as feminine. If you've got high feminine and high masculine, that's when you'll be classed as androgynous. And there's also a fourth category as well, where you score low on masculine and low on feminine, and then you'd be classed as undifferentiated. Okay, so this is the questionnaire we use and that we're going to do in our next lesson. So now we're going to have a look at the AO3 and the evaluation points for androgyny and the BSRI. So one of the main criticisms of the BSRI is that it lacks temporal validity. And because it was developed over 40 years ago, behaviours that were regarded as typical back then have now changed. So there is this debate that the BSRI is outdated and that the scale itself no longer has relevance in our time period. And Hoffman in 2001 actually studied this particular problem, and he found that only 2 terms on the BSRI were still endorsed by people in our time period as masculine or feminine, and they were the actual adjectives masculine and feminine. Every other term, so there's 60 terms overall, so 58 of those terms were not classed as masculine or feminine anymore. Only 2 out of the 60 were. So it shows us that the BSRI is no longer relevant, which is a big issue and a major issue with the temporal validity of this particular questionnaire. As with any questionnaire, you've got the issue of it being subjective. So people's interpretations of the words or people's interpretations of the 7-point scale may be completely different. 2 people could sit down and interpret the questionnaire completely differently. So their answers might not represent what the researcher is actually looking for. And therefore, the questionnaire will lack internal validity. There is a problem with the methodology and the way the questionnaire is actually conducted. A further issue with this questionnaire is that, and the BSRI, is that it oversimplifies a very, very complex concept. The concept of gender identity and androgyny is very, very complex. Okay, and it's going to involve biology, it's going to involve your environment, your parents. So it's going to be a mixture of nature and nurture. And this is far, far, far too complex to reduce down to a single score, like you get out of the BSRI. And there have been alternatives made. People have tried to come up with alternatives to the BSRI, but they still all attempt to quantify gender and gender identity into a single score. And it's really important that we must consider the broader issues when we're looking at gender identity. Things like a person's interests, their own perception of their own abilities. That range of different things have to be taken into consideration, not just reducing it down to one particular score for a person's gender. So we've looked at a lot of weaknesses. We're going to have a little look at 2 quick strengths of the questionnaire now, and it does appear to be very valid and reliable. So for validity, it was originally piloted on 1,000 students, the questionnaire, and the results strongly correlated with their own description of their gender identity. So someone who saw themselves as masculine would have got a high masculine score on the BSRI. Someone who saw themselves as androgynous would have scored highly on the feminine and masculine scores on the BSRI. So it does show us that it is a valid measure. It's also been shown to be reliable. So in the original study, when they did this, they tested the same students again 1 month later, and they got similar scores. So it shows it has got high test-retest reliability. If we repeat the test, we do get the same scores later on.